I'm Josh Green.
And I'm John Heilemann. And with all due respect to President Obama... Hello?
I just wanted to say congratulations. I'm really proud of you.
Oh, thanks, Mr. President. Happy National Chocolate Pudding Day, sports fans. If you are happy to hear the news from the Supreme Court today, you're probably out celebrating. If you're watching this right now, our sympathies. Here's how President Obama commemorated the gay marriage ruling in the Rose Garden, with the birds literally chirping.
It is a consequence of the countless small acts of courage of millions of people across decades, folks who were willing to endure bullying and taunts and stayed strong and came to believe in themselves and who they were. And slowly made an entire country realize that love is love. Those countless, often anonymous heroes, they deserve our thanks. They should be very proud. America should be very proud.
Meanwhile, it's been a sad trombone day for Republicans. On one end, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, and John Kasich say they disagree with the ruling, but that it's time to move on. Other candidates had more pointed criticism, like Mike Huckabee, who said he would, quote, not acquiesce to an imperial court, and Ted Cruz, who told Sean Hannity just now that we have just lived through, quote, some of the darkest 24 hours in our nation's history. Whew. Boy. All right, Josh. The Republicans seem a little more torqued about this, or a little more confused than Democrats do. How do you think this is going to play out politically on the Republican side in 2016?
Well, the oddity of today's ruling is it really settles gay marriage as a national issue. It's legal. Everybody can get married in every state. But I think the reaction we saw from Republican presidential candidates shows that it's going to continue to be an issue and a problem for Republicans. You had some who came out and said essentially, this is the rule of law. I don't agree with it, but let's move on. But then you had others like Scott Walker come out and call for a constitutional amendment. And then Ted Cruz saying this is a worse event than even, 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. I think the danger here is that this can be a wedge issue for Republicans against Republicans. If you're one of these 13 presidential candidates, a social conservative, trying to stand out, here is a way you can differentiate yourself from frontrunners like Jeb Bush by coming out and making this an issue in a place like Iowa that's filled with social conservatives. And that's a danger for Republicans.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Look, I mean, it's clear that the establishment candidates in the top tier, Scott Walker aside, I'll talk about him in a second, do want to get in a place where they don't offend gay and lesbian Americans, and they want to say, well, I disagree personally, but it's time to move on, as we said. Scott Walker, the big exception, he is running so hard to the right now. One of the rival campaigns provided me today with a litany of statements that Walker has made in the past where he's shied away from the idea of a constitutional amendment. Now suddenly he's out there demanding a constitutional amendment on marriage. Boy, he is putting himself in some jeopardy, I think, in terms of his general election viability by pursuing that strategy. Okay, we're moving on. After speaking in the Rose Garden, President Obama flew to Charleston to eulogize Clementa Pinckney, the senior pastor shot to death along with 8 others in the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. The shooting has plunged the country into a grim reflection on race relations, and one product of that has been a kind of unity born out of tragedy. It should say something that on the flight to Charleston was House Speaker John Boehner, his first flight on Air Force One during Obama's presidency. In his eulogy, President Obama performed passionately, belting out Amazing Grace and bringing the audience into chorus with him. He also confronted head-on the newfound national discussion about race in America.
For too long, we've been blind to the way past injustices continue to shape the present. That's right. Perhaps we see that now. Perhaps this tragedy causes us to ask some tough questions about how we can permit so many of our children to languish in poverty, or attend dilapidated schools, or grow up without prospects for a job or for career. Perhaps it causes us to examine what we're doing to cause some of our children to hate. Maybe we now realize the way racial bias can infect us even when we don't realize it. So that we're guarding against not just racial slurs, but we're also guarding against the subtle impulse to call Johnny back for a job interview, but not Jamal.
Josh, as awful as the Charleston shooting was, do you think the cumulative reaction has been a sign of potential progress on race or a mirage?
I think this time it's been clear progress, and there were a number of remarkable things that have happened, beginning with really the Republican-led crusade to take down the Confederate flag, both in South Carolina and Mississippi and other places, but also, I think, to undertake a kind of personal introspection that's led to some really remarkable changes. And the guy that stands out the most to me is South Carolina Congressman, a Republican, Mick Mulvaney, who said, it is a poor reflection on me that it took the shooting of my friend and colleague, Clementa Pinckney, to recognize the pain that this flag has caused in others. I'm going to reverse my position. I think we should take it down. That's the kind of change I think we've seen, and the reason why this is going to be more than just a fleeting national conversation that doesn't really lead to anything in the end.
Well, it's interesting. There's no doubt that the debate on the Confederate flag moved much faster than almost anyone expected, and the consensus that emerged really in the span of about 72 hours really was quite remarkable. At the same time, the concrete parts of President Obama's eulogy today, and I commend him for an incredible speech, but when he talks about gun control, when he talks about some of the other agenda items, it's still not clear to me that there is much will on the Democratic side or in the White House to go back and refight the gun control battle or to try to make any kind of tangible progress. I have no doubt this has been in some ways a clarifying moment for America. I just wonder whether 2 years from now or even 2 months from now there will be anything we have to show for it other than the Confederate flag having been taken down from a few southern states. All right. To recap President Obama's week, Obamacare, check. Trade, check. Gay marriage, check. And then that powerful eulogy we just talked about. So, Josh, apart from the sadness of Charleston, that's been a pretty incredible week for President Obama. Do you think we can go so far as to say it is the best week he's had in his second term?
There is no question this is the best week he's had in his second term. He's gotten wins not just on the big issues we talked about, but even on ones that came under the radar a little bit, like the housing discrimination ruling by the Supreme Court. Big win for liberals that really nobody was expecting. I think this may wind up being the high point of Obama's second term, but certainly everything, even the tragedy, as we talked about, seems to have had at least kicked off a discussion with some clear positive effects, not just for Democrats and Obama, but for the country and the culture as a whole. Well,
and I also think, you look at the way that President Obama spoke today suggested a certain kind of liberation, speaking about race in a way more forthrightly than he has, I would say, since the 2008 race speech. But gosh, you can't understate or overstate the extent to which seeing the Supreme Court for a second consecutive time come down in favor of Obamacare. That will be his domestic policy legacy, his greatest one. And now twice it's survived. It is now, as he believes, becoming more and more ingrained in the fabric of American life. That alone would make it the biggest week of his second term. But you throw trade in there, and it's a pretty big week. Hard to see him having a better one over the course of the next 2 years. All right. Coming up, David Boies, the super litigator who predicted right here on this set in January that the Supreme Court would make gay marriage legal in all 50 states. Boies' victory lap and super hot takes when we come back. Our guest tonight is super lawyer David Boies, who's been at the forefront of the gay rights battle since the showdown to overturn California's Proposition 8. David, first of all, I want to go back to January when you predicted right here in that chair that the Supreme Court would make gay marriage legal in all 50 states. Let's look at you right now.
I think it's inevitable. It's the right thing to do. It's long overdue, and I think we're going to have it this year.
I don't know who that bearded freak was you were talking about.
Yeah.
Is there anything about this decision today that you said just now off camera, you said you were getting a little nervous. Was there anything about this opinion and this decision that surprised you, even given your prediction?
Not really. I think one thing that was uncertain was whether the court would come down strongly on both equal protection and due process. The court did, establishing that it's a constitutional right, both under the Equal Protection Clause and under the Due Process Clause. It's a very powerful opinion by Justice Kennedy. I think it's everything we could hope for.
Right. I want to go through the Kennedy's opinion, Roberts' opinion, and Scalia's opinion just in a little. Just get you a kind of comment on it a little bit. Justice Kennedy wrote this. I'm going to read a relatively long thing here. He says, "Would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. They ask for equal dignity. The Constitution grants them that right." Could you have asked for anything more in terms of the arguments you had made, on this issue, and what advocates for this right had fought for?
No, I think he said it so well and so elegantly there. I mean, what we've said from the beginning was that this kind of discrimination seriously harms gay and lesbian citizens, seriously harms the children that they're raising, and doesn't hurt anybody. As he's saying there, this doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't impair any heterosexual's marriage. It simply restores to these people the rights that they should have of equality.
There were those who thought that Chief Justice Roberts might join with the majority. I know you thought there was a chance that would happen. Justice Roberts, I want to read from his opinion. I want to get your view of this. He says the majority's decision is an act of will, not legal judgment. The right it announces has no basis in the Constitution or this court's precedent. The majority expressly disclaims judicial caution and omits even a pretense of humility, openly relying on its desire to remake society according to its own, quote, new insight into the, quote, nature of injustice. And then he later says, whether same-sex marriage is a good idea should be of no concern to us. Under the Constitution, judges have power to say what the law is, not what it should be. His argument is, in the Equal Protection Clause, it's just not there. And we might like gay marriage, we might not like gay marriage, but it's not there. You can't find it in the Constitution. How do you respond to that?
Well, you find it right in the Constitution where it says equal protection of the laws. It says everybody's equal. The court ruled in 1967 that the Equal Protection Clause said you can't say to people of different races you can't get married. Now they're saying you can't say that because of sexual orientation you can't marry the person you love. We have expanded the concept of equality, but the concept of equality is written into our Constitution in the Equal Protection Clause. The purpose of the courts is to interpret the Constitution. It is to protect fundamental rights. If they're not going to protect those fundamental rights, we don't need a Constitution and we don't need a Supreme Court.
All right. I want to go to Justice Scalia. I like having these up on the big wall,
that's great.
especially for Scalia. I like having these up. We have one here. He's referring to Justice Kennedy's majority opinion, where Justice Kennedy talks about intimacy and spirituality as being components of marriage. Justice Scalia says, whoever thought that intimacy and spirituality, whatever that means, were freedoms. And if intimacy is, one would think the freedom of intimacy, he puts in capital letters, I like that, is abridged rather than expanded by marriage. Ask the nearest hippie. He later goes on and quotes again from Justice Kennedy, and he says that if he had ever been asked to join an opinion that began with these words, the Constitution promises liberty to all within its reach, a liberty that includes certain specific rights that allow persons within a lawful realm to define and express their identity, I would hide my head in a bag. And then he says that those are mystical aphorisms that you would find on a fortune cookie. Here's my question about this. Now, the fact that Justice Scalia is against gay marriage, not surprising. But does he not, this is a collegial body, the Supreme Court. This seems like such an incredibly harsh trashing of a colleague. How do you maintain the collegiality of the court when one member is talking about the other that way?
I was surprised at the extent to which Justice Scalia attacked Justice Kennedy personally and sort of attacked his words, not the concepts, not the legal reasoning, but just sort of an almost ad hominem kind of attack. Right. I think that probably reflects Justice Scalia's frustration. Right. Justice Scalia predicted this 12 years ago to the day. Right. 12 years ago in Lawrence in his dissent, he said, gay marriage is coming. You can't stop it. He said, how are we ever going to say that you can prevent people from getting married? Certainly not on the basis of procreation. Nobody believes that's the purpose of marriage. That's what he said 12 years ago. And I think he saw it coming. He saw this train coming. He is personally very opposed to it. And I think what you see there is speaking out of frustration.
Right. I got to ask you a question about you personally here. You know, you have had a storied legal career. You've been involved in a lot of different kinds of litigation, 50 years really in the business, right? If you think about your legacy, the things you've been involved in, is this right at the top of the list as the most important thing you've done?
It's right at the top. I can't think of any case I've been involved in that has been more important or more satisfying. To see the difference that it makes in people's lives, to see the difference having dignity and the ability to marry the person they love, to be with a loved one in times of trouble, to raise their children in a stable marriage, to see what that means to them and to their families, to their parents, to their children, to their relatives, has been moving.
Well, there have obviously been a lot of people who played a big role in this, and you have a right to claim to be one of them.
Well, there are a lot of people. I mean, and
yeah.
One of the things that I thought that President Obama got exactly right today, which is that the real heroes here are the gay men and women over decades who came out, expressed their identity, stood proud, and made all of us recognize them for what they were, which is simply another American citizen who deserves all the equal rights. Those were the people who really drove this decision.
All right, David Boies, thank you. Thanks for coming in. We'll be right back with the Reverend Calvin O. Butts of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem after this. Joining us now is the Reverend Calvin O. Butts of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Reverend, thank you for coming up.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, you knew Reverend Clem Pinckney a little bit. What do you remember about him and his life?
I did not know him. I know of him, knew of him. And what I did know of him was that he was very active politically,
right,
and that he was a good minister in that area, highly regarded. I heard a lot of people, lawyers and others in this area, speak of him with great respect.
All right, I want to play a couple pieces of sound from the eulogy today of President Obama. He talked about race relations. It was kind of woven throughout the speech, but in particular, I want to play you this, and we'll talk about it in a second.
None of us can or should expect a transformation in race relations overnight. Every time something like this happens, somebody says, we have to have a conversation about race. We talk a lot about race. There's no shortcut. We don't need more talk. None of us should believe that a handful of gun safety measures will prevent every tragedy. It will not. But it would be a betrayal of everything Reverend Pinckney stood for, I believe, if we allowed ourselves to slip into a comfortable silence again.
Right.
Since the shootings in Charleston, there's been some progress on certain fronts with the flag. We'll talk about that in a moment. But at this moment, do you think this is a moment where there might be some real progress in terms of race relations? Is this the kind of thing that could spur real change? Or is this going to be kind of a sentimental moment where we all talk about how we want to get along and then go back to our original sins?
I think it will probably be another sentimental moment when we'll go back to our original sins. After 9/11, we made some pronouncements. Now, we've taken certain security measures, but we really have not dug deep into the problem of how something like that could happen. And we were hugging and we were embracing and we were inspiring. But I think we've been lulled back into a complacency which is dangerous for our nation. I think the same thing is going to be true with race. We seem to be going backwards. We were at one time in busing and integration, and now we have an African-American president. But look at the hell that he's caught. Now, he's had a great week, but this speech now is at the end of his term. Imagine if he could have made a speech like this at the beginning, absent the tragedy. It would have had much greater impact. We've had certain criticisms about how we move, and killing, while it is absolutely ridiculous and it's heinous, but what about the mortgage scandal? What about what's happening in education? And the president alluded to these things in his eulogy. These are the things we're going to have to drill down on, and with much stronger emphasis coming from the top.
Well, I mentioned the Confederate flag. President Obama talked about that also in his speech and said, look, this isn't just a symbol of ancestral pride. It's a symbol of oppression. It's a symbol of traitorous behavior on the part of the Confederacy. You went to Morehouse.
I did.
Are you surprised it took this long for us to get to this place, at least with respect to the Confederate flag itself?
No. And I don't think we would be here even now if it wasn't so close to an election. And you can note one thing. While the president praised the governor of South Carolina, she did not take that flag down until after Reverend Pinckney had to be escorted by it. It was an insult. And I think the deep-seated hatred that's in places like South Carolina, pockets there, is still across the country.
We even have Republicans now, though, and I don't dispute any of the things you just said, but we have Republicans now talking about taking down statues of Jefferson Davis, others from public spaces. Mitch McConnell has made that proposal. How do you feel about that? I think everyone now agrees Confederate flag should go down. What's the place for any kind of memorials around the Confederacy? Should those all be gone? Busts, statues in all public spaces?
I haven't thought that deeply about it because it really doesn't matter. They can stay. If you're going to take down symbols of hatred and bigotry, you've got to start in front of the, is it the Museum of Natural History, where Teddy Roosevelt is riding on his horse here in New York, and he's got a black man at one boot and a native man, a so-called Indian at the other. That's as racist as that flag is. The symbols are important to be removed. But the kind of discrimination that you see in schools, in mortgage scandals, the kind of discriminations you see in media are things that have to be addressed. And only the women and men at the top who can come down heavy and say, we will not tolerate this, and I will put all of my resources behind wiping it out, will win.
Let me ask you one more question. We only have about 30 seconds, but in keeping with that point you just made, in toto, at this point, 6.5 years into President Obama's presidency, are you disappointed that he hasn't led more on this issue, or do you think he's done about as well as could be expected?
I think he's done about as well as can be expected. I applaud this president because of all the presidents that I've known in my lifetime, he's been one of the best. He's certainly one of the smartest. And he has been in a difficult place, and he has handled that well. I am hoping only that he will not be the last, because that'll be another indication of how far we've come in race.
Reverend Calvin O. Butts, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with the video of what happened at the end of that eulogy, the president and Amazing Grace, after this. My thanks to my pal Josh Green down there in Washington for helping me out today. We are always on. That means 24/7 on BloombergPolitics.com. On the television, we're on twice a day at 5 and 8. Until next week, enjoy listening to President Obama singing Amazing Grace.
Sing grace, how sweet the sound